gathering on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. Since time immemorial, the Coast Salish have called Whidbey Island home, stewarded this bountiful land for millennia. We honor Coast Salish elders, their descendants, and future generations who continue their lifeways on and around Whidbey Island. And I do like to say before I start these that I am a Euro-American. I've learned my history from largely Euro-American sources. So it builds in a cultural bias that I am not able to overcome, but that I work hard to overcome. So I just want to, it's my disclaimer that I apologize in advance for any omissions or mistakes that I make that Native people telling their own stories might not agree with. Okay, here we go. Are you ready? So the last time, would you like to? There we go. Okay. So the last time that we were here, we were talking about, is this working? Okay. Last time we were here, we were talking about the first contacts, right? We did talk a little bit about different tribal presence here, but we were talking about the Spanish explorers, the English explorers, the American explorers, and we got them up to 1792 when George Vancouver took possession of New Georgia, i.e. our territory, for King George III on his birthday. And it was a good place to end a troublesome story. So I want to at least finish that narrative. Where I left it was that England and Spain were having duking it out over whose dominion this was going to be. Amusingly, we reflect that they weren't caring much about Native people's dominion over their own traditional lands for millennia, but they could not figure it out. We had George Vancouver and we had Juan Francisco de la Bodega Quadra from Spain, who were on Vancouver Island in Nootka Sound. They had come to negotiate whose territory this was. Was it the Spanish Empire? Was it the British Empire? And they could not come to a resolution. And so they decided to kick it back to their respective kings, which is where we left them. So in the end, after much brouhaha over a couple of years back in London, they decided, both governments decided that neither one of them could claim at least Nootka Sound and this territory, and that they should remove all their forts and all their trading apparatus in Nootka Sound and have it be an open port to all nations. So absolutely nothing was decided, but at least there wasn't a war between Spain and England. So what was America, what were the United States doing through all of this? Well, you know, we didn't really show up here until at least 1840 as Americans. The American presence didn't come here until 1841 for the very first time. So what happened between 1792 and 1841? Well, that was just British people trying to occupy native lands. So why do we care? We're Americans. The Brits lost. What's to talk about? There's a lot. It's really fun stuff. Okay, so for those of you who didn't see it last week, my little special wooey trick with the map. Yes?
When you say here, do you mean Whidbey Island? Because didn't 1803 Jefferson send out Lewis and Clark?
I am gonna get to Lewis and Clark. You are good. You should be sitting in the front row. You're right. There's a lot that's going to happen before Lewis and Clark, believe it or not. So I like to always reorient everybody to how Native people might have perceived this land if they were going to draw a map. And that is to get rid of that whole northeast-west thing on where the north is always on the top. What kind of cultural bias is that? And what does it mean for where we are? Sorry, that's the doorbell from the Zoom recording. So that's, so what you see here is, the star is on Whidbey Island, Central Whidbey, Penn Cove. And as you can see, especially because it's a topographical map, this is geographically a very insular space, kind of a mushroom with Penn Cove, Whidbey Island sitting at the very center of this very consistent uh, culture of the Coast Salish. And I would like to ask the Zoom people to please mute themselves. Well done, thank you. That's for posterity. So besides the fact that this is I-5 and I-90 in native waterways coming together right here, it's also a place where three major river systems are coming in on the east side of the island. And so all the trade that native people have evolved over the centuries with plateau people on the east side of the Cascades, they're coming over these river drainages, they're accessing saltwater resources coming over these passes. And so you're really not going to get too far in Coast Salish life without passing through central Whidbey Island on one waterway or another. So this is a map we saw last week of basically a very generic breakdown when Europeans first came here, which tribes were on which parts of our island as traditionally. But I always have to lay out the caveat that boundaries, paper boundaries, lines, chalk lines on the map were not something that was definitely not a native concept. So when you keep in mind that these were not, the Coast Salish had a very village level governance, right? The headmen, they didn't have chiefs until it was time to sign treaties. They didn't have representative government. What you had was powerful family leaders, village leaders that that generally had respect because of wealth and wisdom that they acquired. Wealth was a pretty big thing in the Northwest. No matter where you were, wealth was the basis of your status. So property rights, well, property rights was, there's probably not a good translation into Lashute for property rights, but they did understand rights of certain individuals to resources. So they're pretty mobile seasonally. They move around a lot in the summertime and the springtime for resource harvesting. So people from other villages, from other parts of the Sound are going to come to access resources here, and they're going to do so with protocols. They're going to ask permissions to use various resources. So for example, if you look at this map and you see the elbow of at the end of Penn Cove where it says Clallam. The Sklallam, of course, lived on the other side of Admiralty Inlet on the Quimper Peninsula. But they did come over seasonally for shellfish resourcing and camas, raising camas on the prairies here. And they did that through relationships, diplomatic relationships with the Skagit that lived here. So, so for the most part, the people in our territory, from Deception Pass down to around Greenbank was lower Skagit people. And Penn Cove, because of its geographical location, because it was at the center of the Coast Salish universe, was a pretty powerful place to be, and they exercised that. So most of the peoples that identify with the islands here would be the lower Skagit, the Swinomish, the Kikialis, the Snohomish, and seasonally at least the Sklallam. So Penn Cove was, as you can, this is a map from a ethno-history of the native peoples of Eby's Landing that was commissioned by the Park Service. And so I don't know if you can read you probably can't read the yellow dots, but these are all different kinds of fish, resources, animals, plants that can be resourced in this area here. It also shows trails, important trails that we would recognize today. So a trail from, say, San de Fuca out to Partridge Point, another one down to Keystone. Those were military, these were places where you could watch for raiding tribes coming to attack. So the fact that we've got Fort Casey and Fort Eby built on those same spots show that great military minds think alike. You'll also see the the trail from Eby's Landing to the village at Batsadsali. This was the shortest or the easiest canoe portage from the west side of the island to the east side of the island. So the most powerful, at least at the time that Americans came here, the most powerful leaders were at Snakeland Point or Jebel al-Shid. And if there's any native Lushootseed speakers in here, I apologize deeply for my attempts to pronounce. Coupeville was the second most important politically village, but Satsali, and then Monroe's Landing had a village called Chakwala. Now there were little tiny, lesser villages around the cove. Which one you lived in was a part of your status. So they had a classed system. The headmen, the wealthy headmen were at the top, and then you had your craftsmen, your artisans, your fishermen, your hunters in a middle to lower class, and then you had slaves. As we talked about last week, Northwest coastal peoples practice slavery pretty liberally. Most of their slaves being taken through war, but often through raids. So these are three historic pictures of the last longhouse that would have been at Monroe's Landing at the turn of the last century. So when you get out there, you can imagine what it would be like if those buildings were still there. We'd have a very different impression of Penn Cove. Off the top of my head, I think most of them come from around 1890 to 1920. So somewhere in that turn of the century period. So I am going to do a little bit of a backtrack for a minute just to get, because we talked so much last week about what European empires were doing out here, I want to just give you the seeds of how American interests started to manifest themselves out here. So on that, if you, those of you who got your packet, did you guys who wanted a packet get a packet by email? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So if you had a chance to read John Ledyard's little account of what it was, John Ledyard was an American who was on Captain Cook's third voyage to the Pacific Northwest, which left in England in 1776. And this was, I don't want to claim that he was a draft dodger, but it did keep him out of the American Revolution pretty handily. He was from Connecticut. He was a very extraordinary person who someday I just want to do a talk about John Ledyard. He witnessed on Captain Cook's journey that the real profits to be made in the Pacific Northwest were the sea otter trade. The Chinese in particular would pay great exorbitant prices for sea otters. And so at the end of the American Revolution, all those mariners, all those sailors in the British Navy and in American privateers, they had nothing left to do. They should be getting up these expeditions and heading to the Pacific Northwest to acquire sea otter pelts, take them to China, and come home and rule the world. So John Ledyard goes back home at the end of the Revolution. He publishes a very popular account of his time with Captain Cook. It comes out in 1783, which is the year the Revolution ends. And this is where the race really starts with American and British mariners. Ledyard, however, is not able to get any backing, financing for such an endeavor in the United States. And so he goes to Europe. He ends up in France and he gets an audience with Thomas Jefferson, who is the ambassador to France at this time in 1783. Jefferson was very much impressed by him. Sometimes I wonder about Jefferson's judgment, but this was a guy with great ambition, very bright, and apparently a great personal charisma. And Jefferson doesn't want to subsidize any kind of fur trading endeavor, but Jefferson, the scientist, has this theory that the natives of Asia are related to the natives of North America, and he would really like it if John Ledyard would find a way to explore Siberia on his way to do a trans-North American hike, apparently. After hopping a ride on a fur trading vessel in Kamchatka. So let me give you an idea how crazy that is. Ledyard was up to it. and up for it. And so he began in 1786 this great trek, starting in Hamburg, Germany. He's walking. He's not going by water. He's going by land. He's walking across Europe through Sweden, gets to St. Petersburg. He's writing back to Jefferson, woohoo, made it to Catherine the Great's court and all this. And I'm on my way to cross Siberia, which, as you may know, is like 5,000 miles wide. And then when he gets all the way to Kamchatka, his plan at the very, very east on the Pacific is to hop onto one of these fur trading vessels that the Russians have, because the Russians have been trading in Alaska and setting up trading posts in Alaska since the 1740s. And when Ledyard was on Cook's expedition, he met and got to work with both Russian traders and Aleut peoples. And so he wasn't at all uncomfortable about walking across Siberia and meeting these traders and hitching a ride, hitchhiking his way across the Bering Sea to get to North America. And then he will just, because he's a good guy and people like him, he's gonna walk his way across North America to get to the East Coast. Now, it sounds crazy. It was crazy, but he got as far as Yakutsk, which is right here. And Catherine the Great thought he was a little bit nuts. He can't be up to any good because no rational person would be doing this. And so she had him arrested and sent all the way back to Poland. And so he never got to fulfill Jefferson's mission. So, and he's a whole nother story. He's just a great, fascinating American. Anyway, so what is happening? Meanwhile, what's going on in the Pacific Northwest? Well, in 1786, they haven't even found the Straits of Juan de Fuca yet. It's still a myth. The mouth of the Columbia River is still a myth. So it's not until 1787 that the English fur trader Charles Barkley finally discovers the entrance to the Straits of Juan de Fuca. So this is the context. We think of this not being something on Americans' radar, but Thomas Jefferson is trying to orchestrate this because he knows that England in particular is a threat on the North American continent, and he wants to box them out. So trying to find a way to keep the Brits out of the hinterlands of North America is a long-standing priority for him. And that's how we'll get to Lewis and Clark in a little bit. So, of course, the Brits have been the most active here with Vancouver's expedition, doing the Puget Sound, charting Puget Sound. And Robert Gray was an American who found the mouth of the Columbia just weeks or perhaps a couple of months before Vancouver. Vancouver and Gray spoke. Gray told him how to find it. Vancouver got there. And then the difference between their expeditions was that Gray only did this harbor here, a little about 30 miles up the river. And Vancouver sent Broughton about 100 miles up. So this is the kind of thing that empires argue about, right? Whose river is it really? Oh, well, Gray only made it into Gray's Bay. He didn't make it into the Columbia River proper. These things are all going to continue to revisit as England and America try to figure out how the West will be won. So while all this is going on the sea, you may have heard of the Hudson Bay Company. There's fur traders out in Canada, based out of Montreal, based out of Hudson Bay. They are making their way like a great exploratory trading freight train across the Canadian continent going west. And Alexander Mackenzie, who worked for the Northwest Company, which was a competitor of the Hudson Bay Company, he actually makes it first to the Arctic Circle from Hudson Bay in 1780, it might be 1789. And then in 1793, 3 years later, he comes back, only this time he makes a left and he makes it to the Pacific at just north of Vancouver Island at a place called Bella Coola. The cool thing about this is he makes it to Bella Coola 48 days after Vancouver had charted the Pacific waters along Bella Coola's coast. So once Alexander Mackenzie, and I don't know if you can see from this, There's a red line, that's his first journey to the Arctic Circle, but the yellow line is his journey to the Pacific. You can see that the English have charted the coasts, they've charted the inland sea, they've started to map out the whole continent. Jefferson has reason to fear. Alexander Mackenzie writes a story of his journal, is published in 1801. Thomas Jefferson is president of the United States. He goes into a panic. We have to get a party together to discover and lay claim to the west, south of where Mackenzie is, because there is no 49th parallel boundary in the west. So that's how you get Lewis and Clark coming when they did, and the way that they came to hit that Columbia River and try to lay claim to it, so that Robert Gray's initial claim was the one that held and not Vancouver's. So nobody in the United States in those years has the kind of wherewithal. It's too early. Their relationship with the British in 1805 that Lewis and Clark came through. As you may know, there's going to be another war coming up here. So the British are working really hard to lay as much claim to land as they can. As you can see from this map, they're going to come down pretty early in just after the end of Jefferson's administration, below what's going to be the international boundary. So they're working their way into the Columbia Territory, the Columbia District, as they call it. So the Americans are trying, as good capitalists, to set up their own trading outpost at what we call Astoria today, Fort Astoria. John Jacob Astor of New York tried to set up a fur trading company that would compete with the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company from Britain. And you can still see a little park there that pays homage to the site of where Fort Astoria was. This is 1811. And as you may remember, there's going to be another war. And when does it start? 1812. So this is not a very long-lived operation, primarily because 2 months after Astoria they drove the first spike into the ground, David Thompson, a Scotsman from the Northwest Company, becomes the first European to navigate the entire length of the Columbia River. And he shows up in Astoria while they're still trying to put a log cabin up at Astoria. So the Astorians didn't have very much time on their own before there goes the neighborhood, right? Here come the Brits, and now here's going to come a war. So once David Thompson has made it all the way down to Astoria, as you can see, this is as close to a Northwest Passage as is ever going to happen. There is no waterway from Hudson Bay to the Pacific, no singular navigable one. But it's pretty clear that the English have ultimate dominion over at least the northern half of North America at this particular time. So when the War of 1812 starts, the Northwest Company that David Thompson was a part of, they made an offer to the Astorians, the Pacific Fur Company, that they could not refuse. They had a choice. They could either sell out their operations to the Northwest Company, or they could have it stolen from them. So they decided to sell. And so then Fort Astoria became part of the Northwest Fur Company's domain. So what you can see in this map here, that at the end of the War of 1812 and 1818, there's a treaty where the Brits and the Americans decide they're going to have joint occupation. You know, you may have learned in school about James Polk and the cry of 54-40 or fight. The Americans wanted to have all of this territory all the way up to Ketchikan, Alaska, which was the boundary of Russian America. And the Brits, of course, wanted at least to keep the Columbia River. So they couldn't come to a good answer on that. And so they decided they would jointly occupy it, which lasted for almost 30 years. So, but the Americans at this point pretty much disappear. Fort Astoria becomes Fort George, named after still King George III, who's still alive in 1818. And so it's going to be a long time before we see Americans back here again. The trading into what's now Washington really starts to amp up. The Fraser River is the superhighway, another superhighway along with the Columbia. And as you can see, they are starting to come down below the 49th parallel to set up their trading forts. So Hudson Bay Company's first fort out here is 1811, Fort Okanagan. And then in 1821, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company had been competing so brutally that they nearly both went bankrupt. And so they decided it would be better for them if they would merge. And so the Northwest Company gets subsumed into the Hudson Bay Company at that time. So you won't hear any more about them. It's all HBC all the time after 1821. So they take Fort Astoria, or which is now Fort George, and they decide to move it upriver. And it becomes what is now known as Fort Vancouver. So this is a National Historical Park. It's right on the water on the north side as you're going through Vancouver. It's like the first exit on I-5. And if you haven't been there, it's worth it. Fort Vancouver was moved. They moved it to the north side of the river because they understood that the Columbia could become an international boundary. And their hope is that if the Columbia did become an international boundary, their operations would be on the north side of the river. So, so that they could keep this as part of what would become British Columbia. So there's Fort Okanagan and there's Fort Vancouver. And so this is going to become a really huge trading operation. Fort Vancouver is going to become the center of the world. From 1825 to 1845, it is the biggest, most active European settlement between San Francisco and Sitka, Alaska. So it's an international port of trading by the time the Hudson Bay Company has got it really going. And what that's going to do is it's going to change all the native economies here. These are really appealing goods that they bring to Native peoples. They bring firearms, they bring metal products, all kinds of things that, that if you are able to trade for these important items, your status, your wealth is gonna pop up. And so you're gonna become a much more powerful headman than you were before if you didn't trade with the British here. So I love to show these two weapons because this is a Hudson Bay Company musket. I know it's hard to see. You might be able to make out that it's highly carved, and it's all carved in northern coastal carvings. The Native peoples had a tradition of carving the buttstocks of their muskets, and they're beautiful works of art where they survive. Also, the dagger that is there was one that a white American sailor who had been kidnapped and enslaved up on Vancouver Island. He was oh, good Lord, made iron. He was an armorer. What's that? Blacksmith. Thank you. Good Lord. He was a blacksmith. And so he was enslaved to produce metal weapons. And this is a dagger he made for the chief at Nootka Sound. A lot of these artifacts are held in New England, Peabody Essex Museum, and Harvard's Peabody Museum, because all the American traders that were out there acquiring these treasures were taking them home to Boston. So once you have this ratcheting up of acquisition of wealth, you also get an acquisition of slave raiding. It really fires up the slave trade, more wealth, more slaves. And so people from far away are coming down more and more frequently. So the tribes that came down to trade with Europeans now that maybe didn't take the trouble to come this far before, they're going to come down to trade with the English, and they're going to come down to raid for slaves also. And so the people that were the peoples that were coming down that were most problematic for our Coast Salish people were the Tlingit from Southeast Alaska, the Haida, the Tsimshian, and the Kwakwaka'wakw, which we also know as the Kwakiutl. They're coming a long way. And if you don't think they would be scary coming to land on your shore with a war party, well, it scares me, and it's a watercolor. So in 1824, the Hudson Bay Company, it hasn't been into Puget Sound much. It wants to explore Puget Sound and see what its options are for expanding trade there. And they send guys out in a canoe to go up and explore the waterways. And so this one explorer, John Work, who paddled up Saratoga Passage in 1824, noticed something that was very different from what Vancouver found. So last week we knew that when Vancouver and his men came into Puget Sound, into Penn Cove, that the natives came out. It was like the astronauts coming home, right? The canoes came paddling out to trade with them. There was absolutely no fear on part of the native people of strangers coming into their waters. By the time, this is only 30 years later, 32 years later, John Work comes through, and all of a sudden it's a completely different reception. All these tribes appear much alarmed on our approach and appear aimed to dispatch on landing if they do not fly to the woods till they are informed of our friendly intentions. All strangers are considered by these as parties of neighboring tribes coming on war excursions. So even though the Europeans haven't been here, the changes that they've brought to the economics, to the trade, to the social life is catastrophic. If you add that to the diseases that have come, these are invisible solvents, you might say, to native culture. The diseases are breaking them down, and the norms of their economy are breaking down their societies also. So, oh yeah, I said that. Okay. So Fort Vancouver is established by the time Narcissa Whitman, the famous missionary who had a bad end out at Whitman Mission, they came into Fort Vancouver and called it the New York of the West. This is how not only busy it was with trade, and this is before the Oregon Trail is opened up, but also the diversity of the people that are there. So if you're thinking you're going to go to Hudson Bay Company's Fort Vancouver and find a bunch of staid Brits walking around, that is not what you found when you got there. Most of the people that worked for the Hudson Bay Company were not British. They were Scottish. They were French voyageurs. They were Iroquois, a lot of Iroquois in the Hudson Bay Company that came with them on through their career moving westward. Hawaiians that came on the trade ships. So what they called Kanakas. Kanakas were a big part of the Hudson Bay Company experience. So of course, these men didn't have white women to bring out here, so they intermarried with native peoples. And so there's a huge Métis population or mixed race people that are here also. So here in 1847, there was an artist who traveled with the Hudson Bay Company, who did a wonderful job of documenting what he saw here in the Northwest before Americans got established. And he did this wonderful portrait of Old Cox, who was a Kanaka, a Hawaiian worker at Fort Vancouver. So, and this is another, we would bristle at the title of the watercolor, but there was an Englishman who was at Fort Vancouver in the 1840s who documented Métis Indians gambling. It's just such a, I want those clothes to come back. So the Hudson Bay Company moving in, you've got Fort Okanagan and Fort Vancouver. We said they expand into Fort Langley, which is just over what's now the border in British Columbia. Fort Nisqually is going to be established down near DuPont on the South Sound, and almost Fort Whidbey. It's right in the center of everything. So one of the traders at at Fort Vancouver, or maybe he was at Fort Nisqually. I'm not sure which fort he was at, but one of the HBC traders writes about it. Puget Sound will not answer as a substitute for Fort Vancouver. In respect to agricultural operations, there being no soil whatever fit for that purpose, nothing in short but pure sand and stones on which no crop even approaches to maturity. I, however, found out a most eligible spot on Whidbey's Island, which is most advantageously situated between the Gulf of Georgia, Admiralty Inlet, and the Straits of Juan de Fuca. This place, if not chosen for the Grand Depot, is at all events to be established to answer for this post and Fort Langley. So there was a move afoot to make this the base of Hudson, Eby's Landing, the base of Hudson Bay Company operations for the Pacific Northwest. Politically, the idea fell apart. If it had not, we can only imagine whether we'd be singing God Save the Queen or not. Well, now the King, right? So our chiefs were not afraid to make the journey down to Fort Nisqually, which was the Hudson Bay Company fort that was established on Puget Sound. It is now a housing development, but back at the turn of the last century, I think in the 1920s, maybe the 30s, I'm not sure, they moved the surviving buildings to Point Defiance Park in Tacoma, and then surrounded it with a replica of the fort as it was. So they do a really terrific living history program there, wonderful events. If you haven't been there, if you're at all into that kind of experience, they do a top tier job there, and it's worth your time to try it out. But at any rate, it was the center on Puget Sound for trade for Native peoples, for Coast Salish peoples. And there's lots of documentation in the Hudson Bay Company records of they called it the Journal of Occurrences, where every time people come into the fort, they are basically signed in. And so we have a lot of information about who was coming in to trade. And our chief, Snetlum, is how they spelled it. We might call him Snakelum or Snatelin. But this is, of course, was at the time the most powerful Lower Skagit chief on Penn Cove. Slocum was also a Whidbey Island headman, probably, from what we can tell, actually a Suquamish leader, and the Frenchman, who I believe was Snohomish. So these are all different people who have a presence at time on Whidbey Island, and they are all popular traders at Nisqually, and they're all getting rich and powerful there too. So they're not, when they get down there, they're not just trading, they're getting exposed to people that are coming from all over, people that are coming from east of the mountains. They're being exposed to Catholic missionaries that are there to support the French voyageurs and the Iroquois who are Catholic at the forts. So when they meet the Black Robes for the first time, they're really interested in them. And one of the great, I think, misunderstandings between the church and Native peoples was that when they were open to what the Black Robes were teaching, Native peoples were thinking, these white people have really great spirit powers. These spirits, they have powers that are on their side, boy. Whatever these powers are, they love these white people because they got all the power in the world. We would like to know how to get a piece of that. Let's learn more about this power that they have, and let's learn more about how not to anger or offend this power. So they didn't see the Catholic Church coming in and adopting their ways as a way of converting, but rather to adding to their arsenal of beneficial spirit power. The Catholics didn't quite understand that part. But at any rate, Chief Snetlum here actually invited the Black Robes to come to Whidbey Island. And this was in 1840. So just before this, though, I just want to point out the first Americans are going to hit what we now consider Washington in the 1830s. And these are the Methodist missionaries. These are the first white women that are going to show up here. And John McLaughlin, that fabulous face on the upper right corner, he was the chief factor at Fort Vancouver. He's notorious and well celebrated in Oregon. He was the head of Fort Vancouver. He represented the Hudson Bay Company, but he felt so sorry for the bedraggled, starving, woebegone Oregon Trail pioneers that he kept he kept taking them under his wing, and he kept getting into trouble with his higher ups. So like, you got to get the Americans out of there. Don't be nice to them. Send them packing. Let them die in the woods. Just don't be nice. And he couldn't help himself. He had to be nice. And so he is considered the father of Oregon. When he retired to Oregon City, became an American citizen. And so the wonderful thing about him and his incredible face, he was very tall and he had this incredible white hair and these blue eyes, and the native people had a name for him he was the eagle. He looked like a bald eagle. And even his haircut is designed to make it look like he's a bald eagle. So the mission, Father Blanchette, who became one of the leaders of the Catholic mission here, he did come at Chief Snetlam's request to Whidbey Island in 1840, and he found, to his amazement, that the chiefs had already brought back all kinds of psalms and traditions based on this Catholic ladder. So what you see there is what was a visual representation of the stories in the Bible, the different ages of the Bible and how you get to heaven. They did it in this visual ladder so that Native peoples could figure out what's the whole system here with salvation and all. So these became very popular all over the region. But Chief Snetlam had one of these and was very proud of it. But at any rate, Blanchette records coming here for the first time, and in the midst of the joyous and noisy chatting was heard a great crying out. All rose up and saw a heavy wooden cross 24 feet long in the arms of numerous Indians who were advancing towards the spot prepared for it. It being solemnly blessed and erected, all following the example of the black gown, went and prostrated themselves and venerated it. Now, some of you who are familiar with the Island County Historical Museum know that there is a remnant, a purported remnant of this cross, or at least one of the, I think it's the post, not the, I'm sure there's names that Catholics have for the pieces that I don't know, I'm sorry. But part of it is supposed to be the last remnant. There are accounts that say that you could still see the cross. It may not have been standing, but they knew where it was even into, I think, the 1940s. Though I've never been able to find anyone who knew where that was. So it appears that this mission, the cross was erected and eventually a building with it out at Eby's Landing, because when Charles Wilkes, the American explorer, is going to come through in 1841, he can see the cross from the water. And he names Whidbey Island Cross Island, because as a Catholic, he was impressed to see that large cross standing up on the island. It didn't stick though. So this is the cutting edge. This is the cutting edge of American expansionism. You know, we've had some missionaries come out here, but Oregon Trail hasn't opened up yet. Charles Wilkes is coming out on the United States exploring expedition on behalf of the United States government. They are here to chart, and they're not just charting water, they're charting land. So he's going to come in, and he's going to come into Puget Sound in 1841. He's going to spend a lot of time down at Fort Nisqually, because that's where the English speakers are, right? He's going to get to know them very well. They're going to get to know him very well. And he's going to send out expeditions over a 4-month period that go all the way to California. So they're documenting mountains, mountain trails, all the way from southern Puget Sound all the way down to California. The very first celebration of the 4th of July in the West was at Fort Nisqually in 1841. And Native peoples were much amused at the fireworks, the shooting of guns, and the inexplicable reverence for a flag. So even in 1841, the Stars and Stripes was a holy relic. So Wilkes, like others before him, did notice that fortresses around villages were everywhere. Now, or at least some of his expedition came up Saratoga Passage and somewhere around Green Bank. His expedition artist, Joseph Drayton, recorded this, this image of a palisaded village. I want to know where the horses came from, but at any rate, they apparently had horses in 1841. But he notes, and he calls them the Sachet tribe, but he's talking about the Skagit tribe, so it can't be very far from here.
It looks like the first Costco.
It does. It does, yes. But the parking is a lot closer to the front door. That's good. So Wilkes recorded that the Sachet tribe are obliged to provide for their defense against the more northern tribes by whom they are frequently attacked for the purpose of carrying them off as slaves. For protection against these attacks, they have large enclosures. In the opinion of the officers, it would have required artillery to make a breach in them. So these are pretty formidable, and they're right here on the shores of Whidbey Island. Meanwhile, you may have seen some of these charts. The Vincennes, which was a ship in his expedition, sent out charters, chartists. I don't know, chartists, that sounds like, thank you, cartographers. Losing a mind to old age is a terrible thing, isn't it? So you see there the first real serious charts of Penn Cove, Holmes Harbor, and Deception Pass that were done in 1841 by Wilkes. He noted, as Vancouver had noted, that the most populated area of Coast Salish peoples anywhere in the Salish Sea they visited was in Penn Cove. This really was native Manhattan. And you keep in mind, you know, they noted maybe 700, 800, or 900 native peoples living on Penn Cove, but they're visiting in the summer when people are out at their resource sites. So it's a real underbid of how many people would have been here. But he did notice that it did stand apart as a real central community for the whole region, and said, upon the whole, the tribe inhabiting Penn Cove are more advanced than any others in civilization. So it's hard to believe that our quiet little Penn Cove was that important, but it was. So there's a few things that are going to convince the British that they're probably not going to be able to stay down here on the Columbia. And so they start making plans for moving operations up to Vancouver Island, because they're not going to let go of that no matter what happens. There's still no boundary out here, but the arrival of the missionaries, the beginning of white settlers coming out, the expedition of Wilkes really make an impression on them that while their government is off in India and China building empire and going to war over other things, they're not going to put the kind of muscle into defending their presence at the Pacific Northwest that it's going to take to keep these hordes of Americans from taking over the region. So my friend Paul Kane, 1847, he's the artist who's coming around with the Hudson Bay Company, documenting what he sees. And some of his paintings are just fabulous. This one is of north of here. It's in southern British Columbia in the islands of the Salish Sea here. And he is noting a war party coming home. This was a slave raid where the war canoes came back, and you can see on the bow of the boats, the men holding things up as they enter their village. These are heads of their enemies. So, hi, honey, I'm home. So head hunting was it was not at all uncommon, as those of you who know the story of Isaac Eby know. So he also documented a raid of the Macaw on the Sklallam on the Straits. He was not present for this, but the Sklallam told him all about it. And so he sketched it the way they told him. And once again, you can see the incredible fortress that the Sklallam had built for themselves, and yet it did not protect them. So he also came to Whidbey Island. And he left this simple watercolor of a place he called Tuanachim, which is pretty clearly Eby's Landing, right where the ferry house is. he also did a portrait of the chief that was here, or the headman that was present at the site. They weren't actually welcome right away. When they first started to paddle up to Eby's Landing, there were shots fired at them, but the native people who were paddling the canoe wanted to skedaddle, but Kane thought that he could use his European charm to get them to stop shooting, and apparently he did. So he writes, in the afternoon, we touched at Whidbey's Island, which divides the Straits of Fuca from Puget Sound. A Catholic mission had been established on the island some few years before, but was obliged to be given up owing to the turbulent disposition of the Indians, who, though friendly to the Hudson Bay Company, as traders look with great suspicion upon others who attempt to settle there, fearing that the whites would attempt to dispossess them of their lands. The only record of Father Blanchette left of what happened to the mission on Whidbey Island was that it was short-lived for reasons too numerous to mention. So that's, he took the real reasons to the grave with him, though I'll bet there are people amongst the Skagit who know pretty well what happened. So as you may remember, 54-40 or fight, James Polk in 1844, this was one of his campaign slogans. He definitely, nobody wanted Britain to have any presence out here. There was quite a great move to have all the North American continent if they could only do it. But of course, that's not what happened, even though Polk did win election. Why is the boundary established at the 49th parallel? Well, they did have to settle. The Americans had to settle and the Brits had to settle. Neither one of them got what they wanted in the boundary dispute. One of the reasons from the Americans' point of view was that if they went to war over this region, it would be the third war with them in 70 years, and nobody had the stomach for it. There's also a little thing about to explode called the Mexican-American War. The fur trade had declined to the point where there were hardly any animals left to hunt. And the beginning of the immigration made it clear that Americans would take hold, but it wasn't worth going to war. If they were going to go to war, they would go to war with Mexico, not with Great Britain. So with Fort Victoria established below the 49th parallel, that was a good enough compromise for the British to be able to keep their Hudson Bay Company domain there on the island. So after 28 years of joint occupation between Prince Rupert and California, finally the boundary was settled at the 49th parallel. And the Oregon Territory was established in 1846 through treaty with Great Britain, and it included Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. It was pretty big. But as you can see, that boundary, once it hits salt water in Georgia Strait, it's going to dip down to include Vancouver Island.